Hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. My name is Ben Twist, and I am the director of the charity Creative Carbon Scotland, which works to ensure that artists and arts organisations play their full part in addressing the climate emergency. I'm going to talk first about why, and then about how the arts should work to address climate change. But to start with a bit of background about me and Creative Carbon Scotland. I was a theatre director for 25 years, producing and directing plays, running theatre companies and organisations. I worked throughout Scotland and the UK and also taught for the British Council. In 2009, I realised that the organisations that influence society, such as arts organisations, were going to be important in the work to combat climate change. So I studied carbon management at university and set up Creative Carbon Scotland. From a small beginning, just me and an idea, plus some supporters in the Edinburgh festivals and the theatre and visual arts world in Scotland, we have now been going for 10 years and we have a staff of 10 people, which perhaps shows how important this work is. Our work is based on the understanding that climate change is a cultural issue as much as it is a technical, scientific, economic or political one. Climate change is caused by consumption, and we live in a culture of consumption. Let me explain what I mean. In 1982, UNESCO held a conference which led to the Mexico City Declaration on Cultural Policies, which said, in its widest sense, culture may now be said to be the whole complex of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual and emotional features that characterize a society or social group. It includes not only the arts and letters, but also modes of life, the fundamental rights of the human being, value systems, traditions and beliefs. This broad definition of culture seems to me to describe the many and diverse ways in which we live in the world. It includes our languages and beliefs, the ways in which we educate our children, the foods we eat, the houses we live in, everything we do. And this culture is fundamentally one of consumption. Humans are great consumers, and our cultures are cultures of consumption. And I say cultures because there are, of course, many cultures: Korean, British, European, different religious cultures, indigenous peoples' cultures. The list is endless. Humans have always consumed things. We take stuff from the ground or from the seas, we use it and we throw away the waste. Archaeologists can see this today in ancient middens in Scotland, where Neolithic people discarded the remains of the animals and shellfish they had eaten. But from the 1980s, global consumption has increased dramatically, and the waste in the form of the carbon emissions that cause climate change has risen just as dramatically. Our culture has become even more a culture of consumption, and so to stop climate change, we need to change our culture. The culture that the Mexico City Declaration speaks of is what I would call a complex social system. It has many different elements and just as many causes and roots: historical, religious, technological, environmental, commercial. It is a dynamic system in which the elements and the whole never stop co-adapting as it changes. Now, complex systems have what are known as emergent properties, properties not of the individual parts of the system, but of the system as a whole. The picture here is a good example. The flock of birds as a whole has properties which are not properties of the individual birds. I suggest to you that one emergent property of the consumption-based complex social system that is our culture is climate change. The emergent property is a property of the system, not any one element of it. So if we want to stop climate change, we need to change the whole complex system, our culture. However, complex systems are notoriously difficult to change. The normal approach of intervening in a mechanical way, where we know that if we pull a lever here, something will happen over there, that doesn't work. You can't act on them in a simple way. You need to change the whole system. And in complex systems, change is non-linear. With a complex system, you can pull a big lever and nothing happens, or you can give the system a tiny nudge and the whole thing will shift. So if we want to change the complex system that is the culture of consumption that causes climate change, how do we go about it? This, at last, is where art comes in. And my point in what follows is that it isn't the fact that experiencing art leads to individual behaviour change that is important. It is that art acts upon society as a whole, as well as on the individual. And maybe one thing that great artists do is find the points of intervention that do change the system in a significant way. Somehow, they have the insight that gets to a crucial point that will have an impact. Picasso, Mozart, Joni Mitchell, Margaret Atwood, to name a few Western artists who have done so. That's why we return to those artists time and again. Now, art is complex and deals well with complexity. It is made by people who bring to it their knowledge and influences from history, tradition, faith and belief, language, emotion, environment and technology. And it addresses those elements in the work, wrapping them all together. We, the audience, also bring those things and we understand them together, not simply or individually. A work of art is a complex thing, and our interpretation and understanding of it is complex too. So I'd argue it is particularly suited to addressing a complex social issue. Furthermore, performing arts are usually enjoyed communally. We watch or listen together, bringing the complex nature of the audience together and responding not individually but as a group, understanding and responding as a complex system to a complex piece of work. And the companies, the orchestras, they are made up of groups of individuals who interact in a complex system. They are not simple and linear but dynamic, responding to each other in their environment, bringing to the event or the building their own understandings and histories. Think of the cast of a play reacting to each other's performance and the audience's response, creating something different every night, which is why it is special. So if we want to change the complex systems that are our cultures, the complex systems that is art, presented in a complex arts building can help. In fact, I'd say it is crucial. And whereas most people perhaps think about art, using art to address climate change by changing individuals, where we have an artistic experience and so we change our beliefs and behave differently, the point I am making is that it is about changing society, not individuals. That's enough theory. Practically, how should the arts play their part in changing our culture in this way? I think arts organizations can do so in a number of ways. First, and this is perhaps most obvious, they can produce and present work that discusses climate change either directly or more obliquely. By this means they can help those communal complex audiences imagine different futures and ways of living. They can take audiences through arguments and thought experiments about climate change and how different futures might look. They can give expression to artists whose insight can provide inspiration or hope to audiences who need and want to understand the challenge we face. I think we need to be careful about the idea that art can communicate climate change better than the scientists, or that its emotional power will get through to audiences more effectively. This is an argument that is often heard, but in my experience, art that seeks simply to communicate something effectively is generally not very successful. Art that explores, tests, challenges, or reveals is likely to be more powerful and more interesting to audiences, and to be better art. Second, arts organizations have large, loyal, and repeat audiences with whom they communicate regularly. And this is all the stronger because in our complex communities, people want to be part of the group and do what the group does. The organizations can ask those audiences to join them on their own transformation and journey to sustainability, encouraging them to take their own steps and make their own changes. They can use the programs or posters in the buildings to say what they are doing and act as an example. Or they can work with, for example, local transport companies to enable the people to attend without using their car. Third, as I suggested above, arts buildings have a convening power to bring people together to think together about difficult questions as a community rather than individually. We are not going to meet the challenge of climate change individually. It is going to take communities working together and the development of a social movement. We need places to come together to do this. When you go to a theatre, a concert hall or gallery, you set aside time in your week and you go to a special building at the same time as other people with the same aim in mind. You watch, listen or look together and think about the same questions together with material and guidance through the ideas provided by the artists involved. And my experience as a theatre director tells me that audiences are cleverer than individuals. They understand more and more quickly than they do when they work on their own. That cleverness, as well as that communal approach, is going to be necessary to meet the challenge. Interestingly, I have also noticed that larger buildings enable people to think bigger and have bigger, more ambitious ideas than smaller ones. A play in a large theatre takes on bigger themes than the same play presented in a studio. There is no challenge bigger than climate change, and we need big spaces to think about it in. As for artists themselves rather than arts organisations, I'm always wary about saying what artists should be making art about. It doesn't tend to have good results. But I think the most interesting artists, the ones who perhaps can find those points of intervention that change the complex system that is society, they want to interrogate some of the big questions that we face, and climate change is the biggest of these. If an artist doesn't want to, then fine, that's their choice. What we need to do as artistic directors or the leaders of cultural organisations or funders is to provide the right opportunities and encouragement to those who do want to join the party. This brings me neatly to Creative Carbon Scotland's work. We believe that the arts and culture have an essential role in achieving the transformational change to a sustainable future. Our vision, therefore, is of a Scotland where this role is fully recognised, developed and utilised by both the cultural world and others interested in sustainability. And our mission is to connect the arts and culture with others working towards this transformation and the fairer, more equitable society it represents. You'll see that I've mentioned a fairer, more equitable society here. I don't have time to go into this today, but there is a very close connection between climate change and inequality. Generally, those who have least contributed to the problem are those most affected, and this is true both globally between countries and within countries like the UK or Korea. The poor caused fewer emissions, but are more likely to suffer because of climate change. This problem is the focus of climate justice. At Creative Carbon Scotland, our work divides into three main areas. First, we work with arts and cultural organisations to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and, more recently, to help them plan their adaptation to the impacts of climate change. We call this transformation of culture because we're helping to transform the cultural sector itself. And although compared to some other industries, the emissions of the cultural sector are relatively low, it is important for two reasons. First, every part of society needs to be part of the effort. And second, the influencing role of culture is so great that it must also play its more practical part so that it provides an example to the rest of society. We provide advice and support, and we publish resources such as carbon calculators and methodologies or toolkits about adaptation. There is always someone to call if you have a question. It can be lonely if you are the only person in your arts organisation working on climate change. We run the Green Arts Initiative, which is a free-to-join group of cultural organisations which want to improve their environmental performance. This means we can learn from them and they can learn from each other, because there is always someone who is facing the same challenges as you and perhaps has an idea to help. We bring everyone together in an annual conference where most of the speakers are the people doing the work rather than experts, because they are the experts. Our second area of work is what we call culture shift. If transformation of culture is where we inject climate change into the cultural world, culture shift is where we inject culture into the climate change world. We believe that artists of every discipline, visual artists, performing artists, filmmakers, whatever, can help bring new perspectives and different ways of thinking and working to climate change projects. Alongside the engineers, project managers and economists, they bring their different skills, practices and working methods to address challenging and complex climate change related issues. From our experience, creative practices are uniquely placed to help reframe the complex issues, challenge accepted norms and values, and offer radically different visions of the type of society we want now and for future generations. And through this approach, partners can bring different skills, resources, and perspectives that complement one another and help to reach shared goals, which might not be possible when working on their own. This work has three main parts. We run informal get-togethers of climate and cultural people called Green Teases, aiming to promote conversations and collaborations. These are free of charge and may take almost any form, a talk, a workshop, a discussion. We have a library of creative sustainability, which is a database of case studies where artists have worked on sustainability projects to provide ideas and examples for others to follow. We've written these case studies not from the artistic point of view, which is how they would often be described. Rather, we've tried to make them useful for the people who work in local government or environmental organisations who have environmental objectives and targets to fulfil, not artistic ones. In this way, we hope to provide those useful examples that they can follow. And we work on embedded artist projects, where we place artists in climate change projects, as I described earlier. This is a complex area, and I'd urge you to read the new toolkit that we have just produced, which provides advice for embedded artist projects working on adaptation and our culture shift methodology. The third area we work in is what I call structures, and here I'm perhaps speaking most to the funders and policymakers who are listening. At heart, we are involved in an enormous change process. We are trying to change the complex system that is society. And at Creative Carbon Scotland, we work on the basis that in order to bring about change, you need to work with individuals, organisations and structures. Individuals can't change if the organisations they work within or with don't want change to happen. And those organisations can't change if the individuals they work with don't want it, or if the structures within which they work don't let them. And by structures, I mean the rules set by government, funding bodies, trade associations or unions, even their own founders and governing boards. So we work with those organisations and groups that set those rules, that create the structures, to help them make sure that their influence on the cultural organisations is promoting change. These three areas, transformation of culture, culture shift and structures, are how Creative Carbon Scotland works. I offer this as an example because it seems to be working for us. It may, of course, be different in your situation. Thank you for listening.